My name is Roel Nieuwenkamp. I'm the chair of the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct. This is a group of 46 governments who have to set up a grievance mechanism according to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which is the most comprehensive set of guidelines for responsible business conduct in the world. And this deals with human rights issues, labor rights, environmental issues, etc. And this complaints mechanism is quite important because in that system the national contact points which are dealing with these questions have to solve concrete responsible business problems.
How would you define the relationship between corporate governance and responsible business conduct?
Well, I would like to frame it as a matter of sustainable corporate governance. And what is important, if you look at the principles for corporate governance at the OECD, in combination with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprise on responsible business conduct, basically it says that companies have to embed sustainability in their DNA, in their corporate DNA. And of course, to do that, you need solid corporate governance.
And how would you define human rights issues of concern?
Well, it depends, of course, on the company that you're dealing with. And for example, if you're an accountancy firm, it's completely different than if you're in the extractive industries. So it means a lot which sector you are in. Just to give you a couple of examples, we work a lot on conflict minerals, and of course conflict minerals deal with armed conflict and trying to prevent contributing to civil war, for example, by fueling the warlords in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But if you look at our garment sector work, it's mainly about labor rights, it's about child labor, it's about forced labor, it's about health and safety of factories, one of the issues which became very prominent after the Rana Plaza tragedy. And so there are many issues which are concretely related to the specific sector. When it comes to, for example, large mining issues, it's often indigenous people rights, which is very important. It's very often stakeholder engagement with local communities. When it comes to the agricultural sector, it's often land right issues, the land grabbing issue, which is very important. So it's up to the company to decide what are the main human rights issues. And I would recommend reading the UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework because they have an excellent Annex A which is translating human rights issues into concrete business language. So that's a must read for all of you. And I think it's important to stress that both the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights in Business and the OECD guidelines are not only saying that human rights and business issues should be included in the company's policies itself, but it also should be included in the supply chain of the company, so actually in its value chain. And that's very important. But it's not easy because there are many things and there are many issues, and some companies we deal with have more than 100,000 suppliers. So how to prioritize, that's a challenge on its own. And of course there are some guidances which can help companies to see where the priorities should be. In general, prioritization should take place on the basis of the severity of the human rights impact. So that means, for example, that you can look at the scale. So what is the gravity of the impact? You can also look at, for example, the number of people that are inflicted. And the third element which you could look at is the ease with which the impact can be restored. So those kind of criteria can be used to prioritize, but still it's a sector by sector and case by case approach.
And how much of a problem are human rights in the business community?
Well, that's also depending on the sector you are talking about, and of course what we have been seeing is that many of the issues related to human rights are associated with large infrastructure and large investment projects which are quite intrusive. So it's not a surprise that the extractive industry, mining and oil operations have been high on our agenda, and they're considered to be high risk sectors. And if you look at our system of complaints handling, our national contact point system, 20% of all the complaints are about human rights issues. Many of them are very serious human rights issues. We've seen serious human rights issues in the agricultural industry and in the supply chains, land grabbing issues, for example. We have seen very, very serious security and safety related issues in the extractive industries. And I think it's important that it's not only the moral thing to do to behave responsibly. It's also a matter of a business case. And what we see is that if you don't manage human rights well, it can have serious consequences, not only for the reputation of the company. And companies spend billions on marketing, and that can be wiped out by one serious scandal. But also the cost of capital can be rising if, for example, the financial sector puts pressure on the companies if they are, for example, involved in a national contact point case. We have seen stock prices falling after a case came in. We have seen interest rates and risk premiums rise. So the cost of capital is important. And another consequence could be that governments attach consequences to negative impacts of a company. For example, by refusing support for economic diplomacy, or, for example, refusing export credit guarantees. So it's a business case, a moral case, and there's a lot of incentives nowadays to behave responsibly. And there are also a lot of studies which have been showing the business case. For example, in the extractive industries, again, a report from Harvard recently showed that major mining operation has to see costs related to, for example, stoppages of operations, of uprisings of people in the local community that can amount to 20 million a week. So it's the serious costs we see. In a couple of high-profile cases we've seen in the NCP system, we've also seen serious costs. A good example is the Soko case, which is about an oil company trying to drill for oil in a gorilla park in Congo. And after a tough campaign from the WWF, Soko was taken to the NCP by a complaint. And by mediation, they had to come to an agreement to stop drilling. So Soko and WWF made an agreement to stop drilling for oil in World Heritage Sites. So there's a cost there. And we've also seen a couple of cases where the company basically was assessed on its human rights impact. The Vedanta case, for example. And after a negative breach of the guidelines was found, you saw a lot of institutional investors, pension funds and others divesting from this company, which of course leads to a higher cost of capital.
And how would you recommend that corporate executives or their boards go about understanding if they have human rights risks in their direct operations or throughout their supply chains and business relationships?
Well, in fact, the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines are saying the same thing. And in that message, due diligence is the name of the game. So due diligence is the concept to manage these kinds of human rights impacts. And it's important to stress that it's identifying, preventing, mitigating and addressing the adverse impacts on human rights. And it's a process which is not a one-off. It's a continuous process. So it's not a human rights impact assessment and then forget it. It's a continuous process of monitoring your human rights impacts and addressing them and managing them. And also being open about it. That's also a very important part of it. And so it's a dynamic process. And there's a lot of complexity to this because it sounds easy, due diligence, but if you have a supply chain which goes several layers deep to where the complexities are, and when you have 100,000 suppliers, this can be quite burdensome. So you need to be able to prioritize. and it's also important to stress that it's a risk-based approach. And that means, for example, that it should not be there to be risk-averse. It should be not about embargoes or boycotting high-risk areas. It should be about going into areas, buying from areas, taking a risk in a sense, but do it in a responsible way. And in general, the work of the OECD identifies 5 steps. First of all, you have to start with building a strong management system. Second of all, you have to identify and assess and prioritize risks in your entire value chain. And then the third element is that you have to have a strategy of how to manage these risks. That's also quite important. What do you do if you see the risks? And then the fourth step is to monitor these risks and monitor the adverse impact, and also using, for example, third-party audits. And then the fifth step, which is also essential, is to communicate about this process. For example, in your report, or have a specific report on supply chain due diligence. This works already quite well in the area of conflict minerals, and the OECD is now working on similar systems for the garment sector and footwear, but also the agricultural sector. And also we are embarking on work on the financial sector that also has its own due diligence expectation. So there will be more of these specific guidances to help companies to take their own responsibility. And I think it's also good to stress that the International Corporate Governance Network, which you probably all know, is also paying a lot of attention to this, and they actually say that human rights and due diligence elements are fundamental to good governance. So this is not a completely new concept, it's a concept which is already embedded in the International Corporate Governance Network. And in other words, it's essential to embed due diligence systems on environmental issues, on human rights issues, on social issues in your corporate governance.
And how can a corporate board specifically address these type of issues?
Well, there's a lot the boards can do. What I said is they have to embed it in their own systems, and they already have due diligence systems in place. But of course, they have to extend them to social and environmental and human rights issues, and that's very important. And serious human rights issues, we say, and that's the same message the UN is giving. Serious human rights issues should be dealt with as if they are legally binding. So that's really chefsache for the Chief Legal Counsel and also for the board. And also we encourage companies when the systemic issues they face are too big for them to solve themselves, to engage in multi-stakeholder initiatives. And many of the companies are already doing that. I think the role of the board is important. You see that the concept of board responsibility is nowadays broader than before. So they also include environmental and social issues, and nowadays the responsibility to manage environmental and social and human rights issues are increasingly considered to be part of the fiduciary duty of the board. And basically what you need to do is to embed that in the systems. And that means, for example, to have clear responsibility in the board, so there needs to be a board person responsible for responsible business conduct, including, of course, anti-bribery, including taxation issues, including competition issues, and many other responsible business conduct issues. So there should be direct responsibility for the implementation and oversight by the board. And a recent study by the Conference Board and the Boston Consulting Group points out that this is extremely important to have oversight to make sure that sustainability has enough attention and is on the radar screen of the board. This is already practice which is becoming standard. And interestingly enough, the Indian Companies Act in India made it mandatory to have a board person which is responsible for corporate social responsibility. And just another example, the Dutch Corporate Governance Code integrates responsible business conduct in the responsibility and the tasks of the supervisory board and of the executive board. And that is very important to stress too. And under the OECD guidelines, the board is explicitly given direct responsibility for certain issues, especially when it comes to risk management. And that includes not only the more classical financial and operational risks, but also compliance with law and other relevant standards. So that's one thing. Then a very important part to embed sustainability, including human rights issues, in the DNA of the company is to include it in the incentive system. And if the incentive systems are not aligned with the talk of the board, then it doesn't work, because then the people on the work floor or in the front lines will just do the old thing. So the remuneration systems should be aligned with sustainability goals. And that's very important to embed sustainability in the corporate DNA.
And what should boards do specifically to encourage reporting and broader disclosure of human rights issues and RBC issues generally?
Well, that's I think a sort of final part of what both the UN and the OECD say in this front. Disclosure. Disclosure is already in the OECD guidelines, has been there for a long time. So non-financial information as part of essential risk information is very important. And this is no longer a nice development. It's standard practice. In the EU, it's now mandatory for the bigger companies to have disclosure on sustainability. So sustainability reporting will be mandatory in the EU in 2016. And similar legislation has already been adopted in India, for example, and even in China for state-owned enterprises, it's there. This is not a sort of OECD idea, it's really a global movement. And interestingly enough, the stock exchanges worldwide are making sustainability reporting also mandatory, pushed by the investor community. And the examples of South Africa, who ask for integrated reporting, and Brazil and many other stock exchanges in Southeast Asia, which are demanding the same thing. Of course, the OECD guidelines are promoting that. They are also promoting more specific forms of reporting. Not only a reference is made to GRI, to the Global Reporting Initiative, which is de facto the standard on reporting, but also the OECD guidelines support and encourage companies, for example, to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. So basically it's encouraging to join the Carbon Disclosure Project, also as part of risk management. And also human rights impacts, like I said before, should be part of disclosure. So that's a very important part. And as part of the due diligence process, like I said, step 5 of this due diligence process is reporting and is disclosure. So it's very important. Well, I always say, be good and tell it. Here you have to disclose what you're doing, else you don't get the trust from society. And the boards, of course, should sign off those kind of reports.
And do you have any last remarks you'd like to make?
Well, I think basically summing up, sustainable corporate governance means a couple of things. It means that you have to embed it in the board. You have to embed sustainability, including human rights issues, in management systems. A very important one is to embed it into your incentive systems. That's really a good practice. And finally, disclosure on sustainability issues, including human rights issues, is essential. And this whole package makes sure that sustainability is built into your corporate DNA. Thanks very much.